And so let me start by welcoming everyone who's tuned in to another one of our Wednesday seminars. It is with great pleasure that I introduce our speaker. Paul Rosenweg is somebody I've known for several years and through several different kinds of engagements. He's notable in the area of policy. He's worked as a Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Homeland Security. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, I'm not going to go through how a deputy assistant is different than a deputy is different than an assistant. But it's an important position nonetheless. And he has been a lecturer at the George Washington University. He's been involved in advising to a number of different groups. He's part of the Chertoff group. He's worked as a consultant there. He advises the ABA. He's been on a number of government task force. And basically the point to take away from this is somebody who's been involved in policy for a long time at a very serious level, has some great thoughts on the issue, and he's going to share some of them with us today about a really unique initiative that he helped start. And so without further ado, although there is one thing I will mention, I'm going to introduce Paul, but if you have a question for Paul based on his presentation, please enter it in the Q&A and not the chat. Okay, remember the Q&A. So with that, Paul, thank you so much for speaking to us today and enlighten us.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here, and let me share up my screen and get us started with this. It really is a pleasure to talk with you. Just so that everybody who's listening knows, I want to be 100% clear. I am not a computer scientist. I speak computer a little, but my life's work has been translating the work that technologists do into the language of law and policy, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Just as an aside, I got that job because back in 1976, I took my first computer programming class in high school. I learned a language called PL1, which is no longer in existence as far as I can tell. And so when they started looking for people to do policy work on cybersecurity issues in the early 2000s, there was only one kid in the room, me, who actually had ever put fingers on a computer and also had a law degree. So you never know where you're going to wind up, okay? You never can tell what it's going to be like. So my topic today is, as Spaff said, something new, a relatively new idea that I've been working on for the last 6 or 8 months about how to use crowd forecasting tools to enhance cybersecurity. Now, let me see if I've managed to figure out how to advance there we go. And now I should be able to advance it. Yes, there we go. So here's my value proposition about crowd forecasting. And I'm going to use a non-cyber model for the moment. Let's say that you were a senior official in the United States government, and you asked your staff the question, will Russian troops be out of Ukraine by the end of 2022? It would be, I think, really cool if we knew the answer to that question. It would be extremely useful to policymakers in the United States and Europe, and probably everywhere around the globe, if we had a good sense of that. Now, I can tell you my opinion if you want, and it's valueless because I know nothing about Russia and the Ukraine. If you were the American president, you could go and consult a whole bunch of experts who work inside the government who've been studying Russia for years at the CIA and the NSA and the Department of Defense and get their answer. Or you could ask the world. You could ask the crowds. The idea behind crowd forecasting is that we can accumulate the wisdom of the crowds. And imagine if you got an answer from them. Imagine if after asking this question in the world, you got a strong yes. Everybody was confident that Russian troops will be out of the Ukraine by the end of 22. Well, then your plans would be changed from the current defensive ideas to, how are we going to rebuild the Ukraine? What are we going to do to integrate it into the European Union? Those sorts of forward-looking things for the next phase beyond the end of the war. If it was a soft yes, but we're not so sure, then you'd do some cautious rearmament. You'd plan on how to rebuild the Ukrainian military, but maybe you wouldn't go full bore on integration into the European Union. Likewise, a soft no, we think it's not going to happen, would be, okay, we need to really think about what Ukraine's long-term defensive plans are, what military equipment they need for that. If it were a strong no, for sure, no, the war's still going to be going on. They're going to be fighting like the Dickens, as bad as it is now, if not worse. Then your real work would be planning for refugees, an economic crisis. There'd be no wheat next year. So knowing the answer to this question in advance would be a pretty good thing. Or if you had confidence in a prediction, knowing the answer is a little strong. If you had confidence in a prediction, that would be a pretty cool thing. So what does that mean for cybersecurity? Well, let me give you a little context for this. For the last 5 years, the main focus of the research I've been doing is on the development of metrics for cybersecurity, generally speaking. Right now, I think it's fair to say that cybersecurity is as much, if not more, of an art than it is a science. We all know that two-factor authentication is better than not having it. But if I ask you to quantify how much better and what the value proposition of it was in dollar terms or in efficiency terms or in attacks prevented, you'd have a hard time coming up with a hard number. And that's actually an easy case. We have a really difficult time assessing the value of security implementations in enterprise management systems that of great complexity. And that lack of metrics is, in my broad context, one of the reasons why I feel as though we underinvest in cybersecurity. It's not because we're ignorant of the fact that it's a problem. It's because we haven't gotten to a point where we are able to express the value of a cybersecurity instantiation in a way that people in a corporate boardroom or the National Security Council of the US government can actually wrap their minds around. So I've written a lot of papers about how to do this better. And there are some people who think you can't do it because it's always, it's an infinitely vulnerable space with an infinite number of attackers, with an infinite number of attack vectors. And so we can't measure a reduction in the infinite. I think that's too grim. Prediction markets or crowd forecasting is the idea that we might be able to harness crowdsourced information as one tool in giving us a better sense of how to improve or how not to improve cybersecurity activities going forward. So this is part of a broader idea that I'm working on, that I spend most of my time on, which is, can we figure out a way to actually bring home the reality of cybersecurity to policymakers, lawmakers, in a way that actually makes sense to them on a kind of bottom line personal economics basis. I should say right now, and I want to be clear, that I've done a lot of this, all of this work really, in collaboration with a wonderful colleague at the R Street Institute, Mary Brooks. She and I are presenting this together at RSA. I was actually supposed to present this after our RSA presentation in February, but as you know, the RSA conference in San Francisco was postponed to June. So you guys are actually getting it a little ahead rather than a little behind. So here's my agenda for this discussion. I want to tell you a little bit more about what crowd forecasting is, what I mean by it. I want to tell you how it can be used in cybersecurity. I want to tell you how we can build a crowd forecasting platform and how we have built one. And then most importantly, I want to invite you to join us in the experiment, because jumping to the end and telling you, we're actually running this on a test bed right now. I'll tell you more about it the test bed as we go forward, but you can join us and make predictions right now. And here's the hot news for all the students. There are cash prizes. If you're the winner in the tournament, you'll get money, actual cash money, which is pretty cool, I think. So the link is here. It's with a company called Metaculous, and it's the White Hat Cyber Tournament, because of course we want good things to come of this, not black hat things to come of this. So my last pitch, which is my first pitch, is to ask you to come and play. We got lots of questions. We could use the wisdom of the crowds. So what is crowd forecasting? The main idea here is that if you accumulate information amongst a large enough number of people who are incentivized to actually give you their experience about future events, that group of people will more accurately than not predict the likelihood or the likeliness of future outcomes. Now, I put trained in parentheses there because one of the questions that people are still debating in the field of crowd forecasting is whether or not the intelligent amateur is as good as a trained professional. Clearly, there are some cases where the intelligent amateur can play with anybody else. I follow American baseball all the time. I really spend a lot of time playing on, but I'm an amateur at it. But my predictions are probably almost as good as the guys on ESPN TV with respect to how my beloved Washington Nationals are going to do this year. One of the questions, the propositions that we're kind of asking about cybersecurity is whether or not we need to limit the scope of who can play to people who are in the field in some way or another, or whether or not cybersecurity spans so large a domain of enterprises and geopolitical and policy and law questions that we should open it up. I don't actually know the answer to that. I hope to be able to tell you in 6 months. But the idea here, which is the good idea, is that a lot of people acting together can actually make better predictions than one person acting singularly. The genesis of this is actually quite famous. It's I don't know how many of you have ever gone to carnivals and been asked to predict the number of jelly beans in a large jelly bean jar, right? Which often has like 1,000 jelly beans in it. And it turns out that individually people are really bad at that. But that if you take all the predictions of all the people who go through the carnival in a week or a month, you basically get the right answer. Plus or minus 5%. It's an amazing, it's been repeated a number of times, an experimental thing. Somehow the wisdom of the crowds converges on the right answer. There are two types of prediction markets that we can talk about. One is a prediction market itself, which is basically yes or no, yes or no answers to a question. So for example, will Joseph Biden be reelected president in 2024? Yes, no. That's a simple yes, no inquiry that we can resolve. The other, which is more informative, but more difficult to operate, but also I think more useful, is probability elicitation. What do you think are the chances that Joseph Biden will be reelected president? And perhaps Spath thinks it's 80%, and I think it's 60%, and Chunyi thinks it's 20%. And eventually we converge on a number that says this far out, the crowd senses that it's 65% likely that he'll be reelected. That's obviously an example because I don't know what the real answer is. What I have to tell you, though, is that the history of prediction markets like this was born in controversy, but is now commonality. The controversy, the first time the US government ever thought about running a prediction market like this was right after the 9/11 attacks on the Twin DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Administration opened up something called a terrorism prediction market, where they asked their analysts to collectively predict what the next type of attack would be from the bad guys. As soon as that became publicly known, it was shut down, because the idea of American analysts betting on terrorist events was anathema. It just was a horrible idea, and it didn't look good publicly. And so the US government's approach to this went quiet for about 10 years. Not so the rest of the world. Today, prediction markets are robust and you can find them everywhere. Most companies use prediction markets for internal prediction regarding, say, product delivery. If you were working hypothetically at Microsoft, they would ask the people who are working on Windows 12 or whatever the next instantiation is going to be. The managers tell us it's going to be delivered in third quarter 2024. What do you think? And the engineers working on it would reach a consensus. They say, nope, it'll be third quarter 2025. Don't listen to the managers. They're selling you soap. That would be a robust prediction that has usually been proven very useful inside internal companies. I have learned with my colleague Mary over the last 5 years that most of the US government intelligence community are running prediction markets about events like predictions about Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. I can't tell you anymore because I don't know anymore, because I have not been read into them, but we've been told that they exist. The financial industry uses this all of the time for predictions about stock trends, new products, that sort of thing, quite robustly, mostly internally, mostly on proprietary platforms that they use as a form of financial advantage. And of course, probably the half of you on the video who I can't see, raise your hand if you do a fantasy football league. That's essentially a prediction market in which you are collectively making predictions about the outcome of the football game, and you're competing against each other as to whose predictions can be best. So that's kind of the basics of crowd forecasting. How will we use it in cybersecurity? Well, sorry, I got to keep getting my clock up because I can't. The screen, I don't see the time all the time. So the first question is, what do I want this to do? What do we want a cybersecurity crowd forecasting platform to do? What I've mostly been describing is what the people who work in this field called information aggregation. Disparate pieces of information held by disparate people come together in a crowd group and wind up making a substantial prediction. They also sometimes characterize this as noise reduction, because one of the things that crowd forecasting does is it tends to identify outliers. Now, we don't focus too much on that functionality because, as I'm sure you're all aware, even outliers are sometimes right? One of the weaknesses of crowd forecasting is that it isn't that good at predicting black swan events. The outliers are the right actors, but they are not the common answer. So that's a problem with crowd forecasting that we have to acknowledge as a limitation on its ability to assist us in making predictions about future cybersecurity events. But nonetheless, it can tend to eliminate the noise of outliers. So I'm sure you've all experienced the noisy person in class who shouts too much and takes over the class discussion, who's wrong. That person gets weeded out of this. On the other hand, as the financial industry example tells you, predictions can also become an actual asset class of value to somebody. In the context of cybersecurity, that would maybe be the insurance industry, who would want to use this as a tool for rating risks and charging premiums in a way that better approximated the true future risk of certain cyber incidents and effects. So are we doing this for people to make money, or are we doing it for information aggregation? And if we're doing it for information aggregation, are we doing it for researchers so that people like SPAF can and you guys can figure out what to look into next? Or are we doing it for policymakers like me? And in the end, at least tentatively, we've decided to focus on information aggregation for policymakers, trying to get consensus views about obscure issues as we go forward to enable them to make decisions with less of the veil of ignorance of future events. Second question that we need to ask in kind of structuring this is, how do we get people to play? In the US government, for example, they can't give out money. So they give out like awards and gold stars. So all of a sudden the leaderboard will say, Paul Rosenzweig is the best predictor this year. And if I go into the cafeteria at the CIA, everybody's, hey, there goes Paul Rosenzweig. He's the best predictor in the CIA this year. We have concluded that obviously at this point we can't just do that. We want to incentivize people, which is why we've gone the more traditional method, which is awarding people money prizes in order to participate in an event like this. And then you got to make it happen. And here I want to shout out our friends and colleagues at Metaculus. You should go there and see they've got open predictions on everything from COVID in the future to the Ukraine war, to political predictions, to global climate change. Anything that has a future event ahead of it that can be predicted is possibly on there. They have a few limitations. For example, one of the questions I wanted to ask in our cybersecurity platform is, obviously we are bedeviled in the United States by ransomware, and there are many defensive researchers who are working all the time at uncovering ransomware TTPs and negating them if they can, as well as backtracking Bitcoin wallets and the like to disincentivize ransomware. They've been so successful that one of the things I sort of think may happen someday is that the criminals, who are actually real bad guys, might physically target white hat ransomware researchers with violence. And I wanted to ask that question and see if anybody else agreed with me. And they said they wouldn't bet on people being killed, which made a lot of sense to me. But with that limitation, pretty much any question you might want to ask is available. There are, however, some operational issues that we have to think about in asking such questions. One is the question of resolvability or settlement. That is to say, how do we know when the question is answered and what the answer is? Take, for example, the Ukrainian question. When I asked, would Russian troops be out of the Ukraine by the end of 2020? That requires us, before we start playing the game, to have a definition of Russian troops. You could imagine it would be Russian troops in uniform, or it might be irregular Russian troops. And what does it mean to be out of the Ukraine? Does that include the portions of the Ukraine like Crimea that they were in before the war started? Or would that not count? You can answer those, and whichever answer you choose is kind of arbitrary, but you need to be able to resolve the question. So, for example, I wouldn't ask a question like, will there be a major outage at Amazon Web Services in 2022 without defining, talking to somebody like SPAF and asking him what he thinks a definition of major would be. How many customers affected for how long a period of time? so it wouldn't be 5 customers for 20 minutes, but it would be 1 million customers for 24 hours. And we would set that threshold in advance and be transparent about it. But there's a settlement question that requires us to kind of define our terms. And that's more difficult in the cyber realm, where there's a lot of ambiguity in some of the things. Will a cyber attack on a piece of critical infrastructure be attributed to the Chinese in 2022? Attributed by whom? And when I say the Chinese, do I mean a Chinese person? Do I mean an irregular group? Or do I mean a group that US intelligence assesses is tied to the People's Liberation Army? Who knows? You have to make those definitions. And in our case, that's much harder than, it's easy to resolve the question, will Joe Biden be reelected in 2024? Because we will know when he takes the oath of office in 2025, yes or no. Second problem with cyber is that a lot of our questions are technical or niche kind of questions. And so we need to generate enough predictions. There's a robust science, as you would expect, involving statistical evaluation that says that 10 predictions is really not enough. 50 is starting to get there. 100 or 150 is better. The more the merrier. There are 2 other possibilities that we need to take into account, and we're going to try and we're going to explore whether or not we've succeeded. One is platform manipulation, or the moral hazard problem. So, one of the reasons that Metaculus doesn't allow questions like, will there be attacks on cybersecurity, physical attacks on cybersecurity researchers, is they're afraid that someone like me might bet heavily yes, and then go out and try and kill a researcher so that I win my bet. So we've tried to structure the questions in ways that are immune from manipulation by the participants in the field. Again, we're seeing whether or not we're very successful at that or not. So far, we think we have. Okay. And then the last kind of challenge is the challenge of privileged information, aka confidential information. It's not cool if everybody isn't on the same playing field, and if some of the participants, if you were asking a question about the invasion of Ukraine and one of the participants had access to US government satellite photos that showed the invasion was starting and others did not, that would mess up the question a bit. So we think we've answered some of those questions, but it's important to make clear that crowd forecasting is a tool. It has limitations, and it's not universal in its applicability. So what have we done? This is, before I show you some of the questions, tell you a little bit. We have, as I said, started a white hat hacking cyber forecasting challenge. Here's the URL again. We opened last month. We're taking predictions. There are about 60 questions out there. I'm going to show you a few in the next slide. We decided to make it an open competition, not to limit it to people we thought were smart about cybersecurity, but anybody who wanted to play. We also invited a number of our friends and participants, friends to become participants. One of the reasons I'm here today is that your professor and I, Spaff and I, are part of a cyber discussion group, and I invited everybody there to come and play. And he said, well, why don't you come to Purdue and tell us about it as well? And now I'm inviting you because you're CERIAS students and you would likely be valuable participants. We've released 3 waves of questions. We are actually scheduled some of them to resolve by the end of May, so the end of next month. And the reason is we wanted to have some results to report at our RSA talk in June. So if you come to RSA and come to this talk, you'll hear much of the same thing, except Mary will be talking more, and she's a better speaker than I, and you'll get to see some answers to the questions. The tournament itself will close on December 31st, but because some of the questions trail in their resolution, we will award prizes in June of 2023. And like I said, there's $1,000, I think it is, to the winner. So there's real money, come and play. So by now you've probably gotten to the point of saying, like, what the heck is he talking about? This has all been theoretical. What does he mean? What are the types of questions that could possibly be resolved in this kind of format in a sensible way? So we've reduced, or we've subdivided the ground into three separate kinds of categories. First, we've recognized that cybersecurity plays on the international stage. It's a geopolitical question that influences governments and policymakers and large corporations across the globe. So we've asked a group of geopolitical questions, government-related questions. Then we've recognized that many of the questions are about industry-wide practices, niche, industry-wide phenomena that we care about, like the question about AWS. Then third one is a more technical incident-related stuff that is probably more tactical. So if you want to think of these as the strategic level sets of questions, the operational sets of levels of questions, and then the technical sets of questions. And then for each group, we started asking ourselves, what are the types of things that policymakers and researchers might want to know? And then how can we craft a question that is resolvable, that is settleable, that we can answer yes, no, and define it. So for example, we want to know geopolitically, the nature of China's aggression towards Taiwan. Will it go up? Will it go down? Will it stay the same? This is a geopolitically important question to the United States. It's probably a geopolitically important question to China. And I would love if some Chinese people were to participate in this crowdsourcing, because that would make the answers more robust. And so we have one question there. Will China launch a successful major cyber attack on Taiwanese critical infrastructure before December 31st, 2022? And if you go and look at the question, there's a whole discussion of settlement. How do we define major? What do we define as successful? And the reason this is one of the examples of something that will resolve possibly afterwards. But it may not become publicly known for 6 months, or frankly, it may not become publicly known for 2 years if such a thing were to happen. But we set a cutoff date for publicly known of June 30th, 2023 for that question. So that gives you an example of how we define settlement and why we define resolution in 6 months after the question closes. Industry. A huge question right now, huge problem right now is the worldwide chip shortage. And everybody I know would like to know if it's going to end anytime soon, if the supply chain problems are going to be mitigated. So we found a source who measures semiconductor chip lead times. That is the amount of time between order and delivery. And right now it's running, I think, last time I looked, something like 22 to 24 weeks. So we thought, okay, a good question to ask is, will the average semiconductor chip lead time, as defined by this industry standard measurement, fall below 15 weeks before July 1 of 2022? Who knows? You, by the way, can't see what other people are predicting early on, but towards the end of the system, will reveal where the answers are trending. But right now, if you went, you'd have to make a prediction based upon your own assessment. Maybe you do some research, maybe you don't. So a technical incident question of the sort that we would like to know the answer to is, okay, good. I'm running pretty good here. Would be, is it really a good idea to rely on commercial online identity services? The IRS thought so. They announced that's the American Internal Revenue Service. They announced they were going to use ID.me to identify people for payment. And then they stopped because other people thought it was a bad idea and it was half-baked. But we thought, well, why don't we test that? Will it be publicly reported that a popular online identity verification service, and we listed the ones that we thought would count, like ID.me, was breached in 2022? And that too will resolve by June of 2023. So perhaps now that I've described this, you have some opinions about this. You have opinions about whether or not there'll be a successful attack on a space-based cyber system in 2022. If you do, come play. Where does that leave me going forward? And I'm getting to the point where I can take some questions from you in a few minutes. First thing, we're going to finish the real world beta test that we're running over the next 9 months, 10 months. And then obviously we're going to report out our results publish it somewhere. Don't know where yet. If it's warranted, we may try and operationalize it. If it works, if we think that by and large, we're actually getting the lessons learned from the test, or that we get useful information that people can use successfully, then we might try and find somebody who wants to do it on a more routinized basis. Obviously, we can't continue to fund it unless we get a sugar daddy foundation who wants to fund it, and somebody else to pay Metaculous, who are giving us their time and energy for free. Thank you again, Metaculous. And you can join us. I've given you the URL. We also have a place you can send emails with questions. The cyberpredictionbeta@gmail.com. It lands on my desk and I'll answer you. And so that's kind of my talk. As I said, crowd forecasting is wildly used in the rest of the world. Policymakers just haven't put it to use very much. And cybersecurity policymakers, as far as we can tell, almost never in the last 15 years. Will it be a good thing? I tend to think so. The indications are that it's a useful tool elsewhere, and I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't be useful here, or I can, that it's too technically intricate to be useful to warrant it. But that's what the test is for. The proposition is that we can use it to make good crowd forecasting estimates of probable outcomes in the future, and that would be of some utility. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I went for 40 minutes, 39 minutes, which is what you asked for. And I would be happy to answer questions. So I see one in the chat. How effective is crowd forecasting when using unqualified people like the open one you just talked about? I could say that the chip shortage isn't going to end, but I don't know what I'm talking about. Well, that's the proposition I intend to test. We intend to test. Unqualified people can do research. If the incentives were enough, Jack, would go and do some looking into things that you thought were relevant to it and make a prediction. There are basically two branches of thought in the field generally. One is that only trained people are effective. The other is that you can train people on how to be effective inquirers. So they're not trained in the field itself in cybersecurity, but they learn how to become effective at making probabilistic predictions of future events. And there are several studies that suggest that in fact the unqualified who are incentivized and learn how to learn are as good, if not better, than trained people. I'm not sure that would work in a tech field like cybersecurity. On the other hand, the geopolitical questions that we're asking sometimes aren't really cybersecurity questions at all. They have cybersecurity implications, but they're really more international relations questions about, Russia's takedown. We actually opened the question, would Russia do a critical incident assault on the Ukraine? And 3 hours later, it was publicly reported that it did. So we had to take that question down. So the answer to your question formally is, I don't know. And I hope to be able to tell you better when we're done. Next question. I'm an actuarial science student. If all goes well, odds are I will be working in insurance. So predicting future events is really important to me. How would an insurance agent use crowdsourcing to learn about rates and methods? Well, that's a great question, Rian. So here's what I understand it to work in the insurance field. And I'm not an actuarial science student, so forgive me if I get it wrong. But right now, today, the insurance industry is in a bit of a crisis. Why? Because their past actuarial models for incidences of catastrophic natural disasters like hurricanes and tornadoes are being thrown all out of whack. The frequency is through the roof in the last 10 years vis-a-vis our historical models. The suspicion, of course, is that it's related to global climate change, but I don't know anything about that, so I'm not going to say that. But I know that it's the case that it's out of whack. And so, in an actuarial sense, they mostly use past practice. Instead, they might want to use a future predictive model of this sort, asking climatologists what they think the incidents would be. I'm sorry, Spaff, I didn't see the note that said you wanted to answer this live. I apologize.
No, I'm just doing that to indicate that you're answering it live, then I'll delete it.
Okay. I didn't know that whether that meant you wanted to speak. Okay, so that would be my way of suggesting that even in traditional actuarial fields, where your past models are being distorted by new events, predictive models that say the incidence, you would ask a question like, will the incidence of hurricane go up 10% or 50% in the next 10 years? And try and base your rates on that. So you might ask in the insurance industry, whether the frequency of ransomware attacks has peaked because our responses are becoming more effective, or whether we can anticipate a fourfold step function up in the next 10 years. In which case, then you'd charge vastly different rates depending upon what you thought the answer was and what you thought the accuracy of that answer was. You'd have to think it was accurate too. But if you did think it was accurate, you'd make your bet. Anonymous attendee, I'm going to have to, about seeing the predictions, I believe that you're probably, are you looking at the white hat ones? Because I don't think that those are public yet, but perhaps they are. In which case they've accumulated enough votes that they think that it doesn't matter if they bias you a bit by letting you know what others are thinking. That the general answer there is they keep it closed for the first intro period and then they open it live. I'm not sure exactly what their criteria is. It's a good question. I'll have to get back to you. Sorry about that.
Some of them are closed. I've answered all the white hat and I've answered all the Ukrainian ones. And yeah, some of them are not showing anybody else yet, but quite a few have numbers.
Okay, well, I suppose I better educate myself again on exactly when it is they make that determination, so that if this question gets asked at RSA, I can answer it. Drew asks, are policymakers themselves allowed to make predictions based on the laws they pass or consider? That's a great question. For the test, we are not excluding anybody, because we didn't think that any lawmakers or policymakers of sufficient import would actually want to come and play. But my understanding is that inside some of the government intelligence community markets, they actually do let the senior leadership play as well, even though they might be part of the decision-making, because it's thought that they might actually have a broader scope of information and thus be making better predictions. That, after all, is sort of why they tend to become senior leaders, that and longevity, of course. But in theory, they're becoming senior leaders because they actually are better at their jobs. And so, what you might not want to exclude from playing the people who you think are the best at doing this. It would be, I think, probably wrong to do that in a market where there were actual rewards and prizes other than acknowledgement and a gold star and your name up on the wall for a month, because that would incentivize people to game the system and win money, but otherwise, no. Brian, are professionals' opinions weighted more? Fascinating question, because the answer is you can do it that way. We have not at this point. The test we are running is everybody counts the same, you, me, SPAF, whoever. But there is absolutely nothing in the world that prevents a platform operator from weighting expert answers better. Then the question is, how do you become how do you define an expert? And that gets back to my two paths that we were talking about. Some platforms weight experts based upon their external expertise. So they would give SPAF's prediction more weight on a technical matter than mine because he's been doing it a lot longer and he's a technical expert and I'm not. Other platforms, including some of the questions at Metaculus, weight people based upon how good they've been in the past. I am a super predictor. I'm not, but there are super predictors or better predictors than you and me, than random, who are outliers in their ability to actually answer questions and make sensible predictions, who spend a lot of time working not working, but playing on the Metaculus website. And, so Metaculus in some contexts can and does give their answers greater weight. I think that's fascinating. How many MVP awards do you predict Juan Soto will win? Well, we're not going to be able to resolve that question for 15 years, but I think 4 at least. Oh, that's good question. Aiden, how we predicted against bots and mass prediction? And the answer to that one is pretty easy. If you're playing on Metaculus, you have to log in and get an ID. You can predict anonymously on the website, but it's pseudonymous as to Metaculus. You have to verify an identity, and obviously that can be spoofed, as we all know, at some point. But it doesn't seem like it's worth it, at least not for the pennies that we're playing for at Metaculus. I imagine that would be a more significant problem that we would have to address if we actually operationalize this and we're using it to, say, price insurance products or something like that. What was that, Spaff?
You got one question at the beginning of the Q&A that I think you missed.
Which was
McCarthy?
Oh, I see that. Yeah. How do people's wants affect data? Might people? Yes, they can. You can make a prediction on any basis you want. The assumption, of course, is that people's wants would not be terribly effective in actually resolving to the right answer. Now, I can predict all I want that, what do I want? Badly, that the Nats will win the World Series this year, since we've done baseball 3 times now. But all the wants in the world ain't going to make that happen this year, because they're now 3-2 3 and 3 or 3 and 4, and they ain't going to get above 500 this year. Sorry. Other than wrong, policymakers are allowed to interact in the stock market, Drew, and people say that's bad. I mean, right now there's a move in Congress to prohibit congressmen, at least, from trading individual stocks and require them to only buy funds, broad-based funds, where their decisions won't affect their own income. But as of today, that's not illegal. And there are many who think that that is wrong in some moral sense. It's not illegal, so it's not wrong in any legal sense. But in a prediction market, it's a moral hazard if you give somebody the ability to make a prediction and then affect the outcome so that you incentivize them to win for themselves. Rian, another question. I do actually have one more slide because I have a reference slide if you want to see it. Spafford, I should show it because that way, when we close, that way it'll be part of the recording.
Right.
I have another question as stocks in general. I was wondering if we could get social media to predict stock changes and adjustments. Social media, well, what I have learned about crowd forecasting markets is that they have to have some sorts of structure in terms of settlement and resolvability, ambiguity resolution. There are sometimes cases in which you throw a question out because it turns out you worded it badly. There's an adjudicative function there. There is also, in some ways, a ameliorating or mediating function. If you go to Metaculus and you have a question, both Mary and I can actually answer what we mean by the question that we asked. If you're looking for a clarification, you'll see a few of those. Those things are much less available in social media, which is much more Wild Westy and free worldy and all that sort of jazz. And so I'm not sure that I would necessarily think that that it would work as well on a social media. Also, given the anonymity there, you'd be a lot more susceptible to manipulation by bots, by people who want to tank your startup, by people who want to pump your startup. I mean, as I said, a fantasy football league is really a social media information aggregator, and it's worth what you pay for it. Some people don't really play that readily with it, right? And so your fantasy football league goes off the rails because somebody drafts only tackles, and has too much fun with it. I am going to share one last slide with you so that you can see. These are some references for the work we did. Obviously, they're all co-authored with my friend and colleague, Mary Brooks, who is a brilliant lady, and I hope you all come meet her and see her at RSA. And the White Hat Cyber Challenge link is at the end again. So you should feel free. These papers have the details. The first is essentially, what is crowd forecasting? The second is, why will it work in cybersecurity? And the third is how to build a platform and why we made the choices we made. And the fourth is, come play with us. So I think I'm kind of done, Spaff, unless there's more you want to do.
Well, I will just say to the audience, I have gone through 2 of the tournaments and several of the independent questions and put my rankings in. So I don't know if you can see mine specifically, but if you want to compete, then please go ahead. I think it's fun. Takes a little bit of your time, and you can do wild guessing, of course, but that isn't the right way to do it. You can give a reasonably informed opinion about many of the items that are present. I think it's a really interesting concept. The idea of Delphi studies, of crowd studies, have been around for a while, and I really commend you for putting this idea forward as a way of approaching this. I remember you telling me about this 3 years ago as an idea, and I'm so pleased to see that you actually got it up and running.
Well, we'll see. I mean, actually invite me back in a year and I'll have some results for you.
You are welcome anytime you'd like to come back and visit.
Okay.
And for everyone else who's in on the call, no other questions have come up, so we'll end here. We have another talk next week, same time, same place. Visit our webpage. I put the link in the chat, and there will be another speaker next week. Actually, we have, I think, 2 more speakers this semester, maybe 3. And then that'll close out the academic semester. But this is the 30th year that we have been holding these weekly seminars. And so thank you for joining us. Thank you for speaking again, Paul. And everybody have a pleasant afternoon. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed myself. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.